All right, in this session, we're going to be analyzing the tangled histories of the Cold War and decolonization. We're talking about the period from 1900 to the present, a time when the world map was just completely redrawn. We're going to break this down into 6 parts, exploring how a totally new global order clawed its way out of the ashes of old empires and the collision of new, powerful ideologies. And by the end of this, you'll be able to explain the causes and effects of this era's huge conflicts, its independence movements, and, of course, the collapse of that two-sided bipolar world order.
So here's our game plan. We'll start with how the world split in two, then see how that Cold War turned hot, and how at the exact same time empires were crumbling. We'll look at the countries that tried to find a third way, see how cracks started to form in both power blocks, and finally, watch as the Berlin Wall comes crashing down. Let's get started.
Okay, so after World War II, the world was just a different place. The old European empires were collapsing, leaving this massive power vacuum. And stepping right into it were 2 brand new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, who couldn't have been more different. This really set the stage for a new kind of global fight.
And this right here, this is the heart of the conflict. On one side, you have the US and its allies, all about free market capitalism and individual freedoms. On the other side, the Soviet Union, promising a totally different path, one where the state controls everything to create economic and racial equality. And you have to understand, these weren't just, different policy ideas. No, these were completely incompatible visions for how society should even work. A global showdown was pretty much inevitable.
And Winston Churchill just nailed it with his famous phrase. It perfectly captured the new reality. An Iron Curtain had split Europe in 2. And this wasn't just some fancy metaphor. It meant real, fortified borders. It meant political repression in the East, which was dominated by the Soviets, and a stark division from the US-backed Western Bloc.
So, what was the U.S. supposed to do about this? Well, their answer was a policy that would shape everything for the next 50 years. Containment. The thinking wasn't really to, roll back communism where it already was. The main goal was to contain it, to keep it from spreading, using a mix of economic help, like the Marshall Plan in Europe, and strong military alliances.
But here's the thing. This ideological fight didn't stay cold for long. Not at all. While the big 2, the US and the USSR, managed to avoid a direct, planet-ending nuclear war, their conflict exploded into very real, very bloody wars all across the globe.
And the main way this happened was through something called a proxy war. Basically, the US and the Soviet Union would pick sides in a local conflict, then pour in weapons, money, and support. This turned things like civil wars and independence movements into battlegrounds for their own global fight. It let them fight each other indirectly, but the cost for the countries caught in the middle was just devastating.
This map just lays it all out, doesn't it? Picture the world, split right down the middle. You've got NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was the military alliance led by the US, and on the other side, you've got its Soviet rival, the Warsaw Pact, which bound all the Eastern Bloc nations together. These 2 alliances made that bipolar world official and really raised the stakes for any conflict anywhere.
And these 3 are some of the biggest flashpoints. Notice a pattern here? They're all in Asia, which became a huge battleground after China went communist in 1949. So in Korea, in Vietnam, and later in Afghanistan, you see these local fights over national identity get totally transformed into these massive, brutal international wars. For the US, this was the bloody reality of its containment policy.
Okay, so while the superpowers are locked in this global chess match, there's another, equally massive historical force just erupting across the planet. At the exact same time, the old European colonial empires were falling apart at incredible speed in this process we call decolonization.
I mean, just look at the contrast on this slide. On the left, that's Africa in 1914, basically a patchwork quilt of European colonies. Now look at the map on the right, a continent of independent countries. This change, which happened in just a few decades after World War II, is seriously one of the fastest and most profound shifts in global politics ever.
Now, what's so important to get here is that there was no single way to get free. It really depended on who the colonizer was and what was happening on the ground. You had India getting its independence from Britain, mostly through nonviolent protest. But then you had Algeria, whose path to freedom from France was a long, incredibly brutal war. What they all had in common, though, were these powerful nationalist movements that got millions of people involved.
Okay, this is the perfect time to practice a key AP skill. Go ahead and pause the explainer. I want you to try and write one single thesis statement that compares how decolonization happened in India and Algeria.
really think about what they had in common and what made them so different.
So, a great thesis, like the one on your screen, does two things really well. First, it points out a similarity. In this case, they both wanted independence from a European power. But then, it clearly states the key difference. Their methods were worlds apart. That's the kind of sharp, analytical thinking you want to bring to the exam.
So as all these new countries pop up on the world map, they're immediately faced with this huge question. Should we side with the US or with the USSR? Well, a lot of them looked at that choice and said, no thanks. They refused to be pawns in someone else's game and tried to carve out their own path.
And this is what led to the non-aligned movement. Now, this wasn't a military bloc like NATO. It was more like a club, a powerful forum where all these newly independent states could stand together and assert their neutrality. It was their way of saying, we're in charge of our own destiny, and we're not going to be pulled into your superpower drama.
And leaders like India's Nehru were absolute masters at this. They skillfully played the two sides off each other. This strategy meant these new nations became a whole different kind of Cold War battleground. This one wasn't fought with armies, but with things like economic aid, big infrastructure projects, and diplomatic maneuvering, as both the US and the USSR tried to win them over.
You know, it's really easy to think of the Cold War world as these two giant, solid blocks staring each other down. But the reality? It was way more complicated. The superpowers started facing major challenges, not just from the outside, but from deep within their own teams.
Over in the East, you had these massive popular uprisings in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, where people demanded more freedom, but they were brutally crushed by Soviet tanks. But maybe even bigger was the split between the two communist giants, the Soviet Union and China. They had a huge falling out over ideology. The Sino-Soviet split was like a geopolitical earthquake. It totally shattered the myth of a single unified communist world, which, by the way, created a huge strategic opening for the United States down the road.
By the time we get to the 1980s, the Soviet system is really starting to buckle. Its economy was a mess, it was stuck in a super expensive war in Afghanistan, and it was trying to keep up with an insane arms race with the US. This mix of internal rot and external pressure led to a collapse that happened with stunning speed.
And this timeline just shows how fast it all went down. It really kicks off in 1985, when the new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, introduces these two big reforms: glasnost, which means openness and allowed people to actually criticize the government, and perestroika, which was a restructuring of their failing economy. The problem was, these reforms accidentally opened a Pandora's box of democratic and nationalist feelings. By 1989, the Berlin Wall falls, and just 2 years after that, the Soviet Union itself was gone.
Now, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it didn't magically create a world without problems. Not at all. Instead, it just revealed a whole different set of global divides. And this map shows one of the biggest legacies of that whole colonial and Cold War era. This huge economic gap between the industrialized global North and the developing global South, a deep inequality that is absolutely still with us today.
Okay, let's boil all of this down. What are the key things you have to remember? First, the Cold War was the ideological fight of the second half of the 20th century. Second, decolonization was happening at the same time and was just as powerful, redrawing the entire world map. And these two things were completely connected. And finally, the end of the Cold War didn't mean the end of conflict. It just shuffled the deck, leaving us with the incredibly complex world we see today.
And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. As you keep studying this period, I want you to really assess how the legacies of all this, of colonialism, of the Cold War alliances, are still shaping our modern world. How do they influence economic inequality, political chaos, and conflict today? In other words, how is the history we just talked about still alive and kicking, shaping the world you're living in right now?